So, should we begin, Rabbi Rich, or? Okay, well, anyone who's in the other rooms, when they hear me start talking, they'll come in. That's probably the best way to get started. Okay, just to remind you where we've been, our first session on Thursday evening focused on bilateral ecclesiology in the context of the history of Messianic Judaism, how it emerged, and the background that gave it birth. We then talked about the changing landscape in the Jewish world yesterday and the changing landscape in the Christian world. Now I want to talk about the new landscape in the wider culture, in the new secular landscape. And then this evening, we will conclude by talking about bilateral ecclesiology and the future of Messianic Judaism. Now, I know there are a lot of really wonderful things going on in the wider culture and the wider society. I'm not going to identify them. They're there. I see things that I like. But the things that capture my attention most lead me to actually think that we are living in a time of divine judgment. And it reminds me in many ways of the period which was the very beginning of the Messianic Jewish movement, the 1970s. A while back, I watched a set of documentaries on CNN about the 1970s. You know that CNN's done a number of these documentaries on the various decades. And if you haven't seen the documentaries on the 70s in particular, you might want to check them out. Although I warn you in advance, they're extremely depressing. It was a terrible decade, a terrible decade. There was a documentary on Nixon and Watergate, and another one on the humiliating end of the Vietnam War, on these waves of violent crime sweeping the country, and the emergence of these cults that were sometimes very violent cults. We had Jimmy Carter and the great malaise falling on America in his term, and the Iran hostage crisis. We had all this kind of revolution in sexual mores that was taking place at the time, and this explosion in pornography, and it was a crazy decade. I mean, we think of the 60s as the crazy decade, and a lot of what ended up happening in the 70s in some ways emerges, obviously, out of the 60s. But the 60s has some stuff in it that I look at and I just say, there's some really good stuff here. And the 60s was a real mixture. The 70s, when you released, there was one documentary on TV that looked about the TV shows in the 70s. That was pretty good. It looked like there were some pretty good shows in the 1970s. Apart from that, almost everything was pretty depressing. And it reminded me then of where I was at in the 1970s. I had come to faith in Yeshua in 1971, so very beginning of this process. And so I had a rather upbeat picture of life that came from having experienced the life of God and being part of a dynamic movement of God. But part of the reason for the dynamism in this spiritual movement was the fact that everything in the wider culture looked like it was going to hell. No? And we had prophetic words in those days. And I say we, this was in this charismatic community that I was part of. But there were lots of prophetic currents in the charismatic and Pentecostal world in those days that spoke about a kind of looming collapse of society and the culture. And we expected it to happen soon. And some of us made decisions for our lives based on that anticipation, that the way things were is not the way they were going to continue to be, that we were institutions that we currently assumed were always going to be there were going to crumble and fall. That was the kind of thing that we were hearing in the 1970s. In the early 1980s, in the wake of all this, I was doing some teaching. I developed a presentation on something I called Western decadence. And it was a kind of sociological and statistical presentation that was tracing the rates of things like violent crime, abortion, drug and alcohol addiction, suicide, divorce, pornography, etc. And the statistics at that time were eye-popping because the changes were all exponential. And so part of the conclusion of this presentation was, we can't continue on this course. Ultimately, if the graph continues in this way, things simply come undone. Now, what happened? What happened was something changed in the culture, and there was like a reprieve. What happened in the 1980s was not what we expected in the 1970s. And the 1980s and the 1990s, things changed. Statistically, you could just look at like all of these different categories that I documented in my sessions on Western decadence when I was presenting in maybe 1980 or 81 or 82. And the chart didn't continue in that course. And I remember thinking, well, you know, those prophecies were just wrong in the 1970s. It was just wrong. We were not hearing God. And I must admit, part of what I shared a couple days ago about my disillusionment with the whole Pentecostal charismatic phenomenon was my sense that, well, I had made some decisions for my life based on prophetic words that I was hearing in the 1970s, and they didn't pan out. Things didn't go that way. And so, really, you can't trust these things. I've been rethinking that recently. I've been rethinking it because what I see happening right now is more like at least potentially, the beginnings, the first stages of the kinds of things that we were hearing about in prophecy in the 1970s. And it just made me at least wonder, was there simply a kind of unexpected pause for a period of time and resuming its course at this time? I don't know. But the one thing I am convinced of, and it's just, I have no authority to speak on this. I mean, I'm not, you take this or leave it. I'm not interpreting a Bible passage or speaking from traditional texts. I'm just, as I said, part of what's going on here is I'm sharing with you what I've been thinking about recently. I think we're living in a time of judgment. And let me just what I want to do is point to some of the signs of this judgment. First of all, and really most basic, to be honest with you, this is what I see as the most fundamental sign of divine judgment, is a kind of unraveling of the social fabric at least in this country. Now, I think it's rooted in something that's always been there in America, which is this rugged individualism, this introverted orientation this high level of subjective self-realization. At least in the last 50 years, this is the way our culture has been. But right now, it's not being checked or balanced. And what we see as one sign of this is what our former Surgeon General has called an epidemic of loneliness. An epidemic of loneliness. This is Vivek Murthy, who was the former Surgeon General. He wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review in the last year. And he reported that over 40% of adults in the U.S. report feeling lonely. And research suggests the number's higher, he says. These are double the rates from the 1980s, when the figure was 20%. Loneliness, he traces this loneliness to its obvious source. The social connections are failing, with a much higher measure of mobility, people moving around family. It's much rarer today to have to be living in the same city with all of your siblings and with your parents. Occasionally you see it, but it's rare. And when people are moving more for job reasons, you don't build up long-term relationships. You can't sustain them. Now, Murphy goes on to say that loneliness and weak social connections are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that caused by smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Yeah. And he says, and he asserts that it's actually the health risks are greater than obesity, loneliness. And so he argues, he says we have to relate to this like a medical problem. It's an epidemic. Loneliness. Another sign of this is simply the suicide rate. It rose dramatically at the beginning of the new century. Between 1999 and 2014, for both men and women, and in every age bracket, suicide rose dramatically. Suicide now is the second leading cause of death among adolescents and young adults. And it's the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. Hospital admissions for suicidal teenagers have doubled over the last 10 years. We all know about what's happening in the area of drug addiction. This has been a lot in the news, and it deserves to be in the news. Now, there's some unique factors, of course, with this issue of drug addiction. It's that come from the overprescription of opioids, et cetera, et cetera. You all have, I'm sure, followed this. But what we also have here is a breakdown of support systems for people that they need to be able to deal with these cases. And then when you actually have drug abuse or alcohol abuse, then you have the results that Rabbi Rich was talking about earlier in his message today at Shabbat. It then leads to the further breakdown of relationships within families and friendships because trust is broken. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death among Americans under the age of 50. Overall, 52,000 died of overdoses in 2015, 64,000 in 2016. 2 million Americans are addicted to prescription opioids and 600,000 to heroin. This is all really exciting stuff, isn't it? Depression, yeah, what you're feeling right now. No, depression is another sign. A sign, I think, of this judgment and of the fraying of the social fabric. Depression is now one of the most common medical or mental health disorders in the U.S., with rates increasing rapidly over the past several decades, especially among the young. The share of 12 to 20-year-olds who'd suffered major depression in the previous year increased by 37% from 2005 to 2014. Yeah, I mean, this has been a difficult century, and we might not even have noticed it. A health problem that closely rivals depression. In my reading, I couldn't tell which was worse, depression or anxiety. The two often go together as issues, but I read one piece that said depression was the greatest mental health problem, and another one that said anxiety was. At the very least, anxiety rivals depression as the most common mental health disorder. There was a major article on it in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. Anxiety has overtaken depression, this one piece said, as the most common reason college students seek counseling services. In 1985, UCLA began asking incoming freshmen if they felt overwhelmed by all they had to do in the previous year. Great question. So in 1985, so they have statistics now for 32 years. In 1985, 18% of the incoming freshmen said yes. In 2010, it went from 18% to 29%. And then in 6 years, between 2010 and 2016, it went up to 41%. Then we have divorce and family issues. Now, overall divorce rates have actually declined a little bit, modestly, not substantially, but modestly. They hit their peak around 1980 at the end of that awful decade, and that they basically plateaued at that point. They remain very high, however, for those without a college degree. Here, what we find actually in terms of the marriage and family issue is a kind of separation, a class division, and that those with a college degree are doing better in sustaining families than those without college degrees. Among those without college degrees, the statistics are really very, very bad. I think this is significant for understanding a lot of what's happened politically, I think, in the United States over the last year and a half. But while the divorce rate has basically plateaued, what's changed is the number of people who are getting married. More people are simply opting out of marriage entirely. In 2000, here's another interesting comparison just over a relatively short period of time. In the year 2000, 55% of Americans aged 25 through 34 were married. So 55%, and 34% had never been married. Then that leaves for the category of those who had been married, and then either because of a death or divorce, we're no longer married. So 55% were married 17 years ago, 34% had never been married. 3 years ago, 2014, so over basically a 15-year period, in 2014, only 41% in that age bracket were married. So it went from 55% to 41% in 14 years. And 52% had never been married. So that 34%, it went from 34% who had never been married to 52%. that's a pretty dramatic change in only a 14-year period. We have more people simply either just living on their own or living with their parents. The median age for marriage is now at an all-time high. It's 27 for women and 29 for men. There was a major study done just maybe a year or two ago by a Princeton economist that got a lot of talk, and justifiably so. And what the study showed was that the United States had suffered its first decline in life expectancy since the 1930s. A decline in life expectancy. And the author, the economist who did it, attributed the decline to what he called deaths of despair. And what he meant by that was drug overdoses, alcohol abuse, and suicide. That those were the main reasons why life expectancy was going down in America. Now, I think these are very complex processes, and I'm not offering you any explanation of everything that's going on. But what I'm trying to point out is there's this sense of a fraying of social connectedness within the society as a whole. We get certain kinds of surrogates, things that come in their place, that give an illusion of connection when there actually isn't one. And I would, and not just I, but what some social scientists are arguing is that that's what social media does. In fact, in this article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about anxiety, this psychologist was arguing that social media itself was one of the causes for heightened anxiety among younger people right now in the culture. But I think social media also becomes this surrogate for establishing community. Of course, it can be an instrument or a tool for doing that, but only if it's set within an actual context of human relationships as opposed to a substitute for them. Because of the breakdown of trust in the way that Rabbi Rich was talking about, what we have is a kind of fear of commitment that many people have. You know, what people most need is one another. They need relationship with one another, but that very fear and mistrust that's come from woundedness prevents people from being able to get the thing that they actually need. So, this is evidence, these are all things for me that are evidence of the unraveling of a social fabric, which I see as a sign of God's judgment. It is very worrisome and causes me to pray for mercy from God. Now, I think this is all then connected to what I also see as the unraveling of the national community. I can be a lot briefer on this, but I think everything that I just talked about contributed to the populist political uprising of 2016. Pitting one part of society, the anti-establishment part, which isn't doing very well, against those who are the establishment part, who are doing a little better in their own lives and families, but still not actually doing great. We see this civil war, not just between the political parties, but internal to each political party. And we see the parties drifting further and further away from one another. And what came out in our discussion time yesterday was how this is just replicated in the Christian world and in the Jewish world and the religious world. Some seek, in a kind of ethnic nationalism, a new community. Again, I see it as another surrogate, like social media, for real community. To try to in some ways reclaim an America of the past that somehow gives us a sense of, yes, we're whole again, we're a community, we're a people again. Others seek it in some kind of minority ethnic identity. But I think both lead only ultimately to greater division and enmity, and they end up being rather desperate, abstract surrogates for authentic community, people actually living their lives together. Now, I kept promising you that I was going to talk a bit about sexual behavior and gender identity. I realized when I looked at my notes and all, it may be really a false promise, because what I wanted to mainly point to some of what's going on today and set it in this broader context, that where we usually, when we're dealing with these issues, we separate them out and we just look at them over here as an issue in themselves. But I think what's going on in terms of the great debates that we face and the controversies and the at times just confusion is itself again a sign of divine judgment in our midst. I'm not saying that certain patterns of sexuality are provoking divine judgment. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying the very way in which sexual life seems to be coming undone for many, many people is itself a sign, again, of this overall breakdown or fragmentation. The most obvious thing we see here that you all know, and if you don't know it, it's because you've been living somewhere else, is we live in a culture that's absolutely saturated in sex. You could only maybe not notice it if you were suffering the boiling frog syndrome, where it just changes a little bit all the time, and you don't notice then how we're just awash, in this, whether through media that is around us all the time, through advertising, and particularly through the internet, and it's inescapable. And this is, every time there's a technological breakthrough, the first expression of it is pornography. That's always at the cutting edge and so now, as you read about the new developments in cutting edge virtual reality, the first thing to take advantage of it is pornography, But the strange thing is that at the very same time as we're awash in what appears to be a kind of sexual permissiveness and pornography, studies have been done that seem to indicate that people are actually having sexual relations less than in the past. I just caught an article on this, the statistical study. I don't know. Who knows? A statistical study. How are you compiling your statistics? Obviously, it's. But it was thought-provoking, because what it seemed to point to is pornography and self-satisfying sexuality was actually replacing actual relationship and connection, sexual connection with a real live human being. And I see this as, again, more of the sign of the radical individualizing of the whole society and people being able to live more and more and more in their own little world. Over the last couple of days, Nathan kept trying to get us to come out of our own little world as we were praying. But we need that exhortation all the time because we live in a culture where everybody is living in that little bubble. Just read you a little bit from a columnist, New York Times columnist who I like, Ross Douthat. He did an article recently comparing the sexuality of the 1970s to the sexuality of the second decade of the 21st century. He says this, relative to the 1970s restraint of our current era, has held lately, at least provisionally, even as we've gone through an aftershock of that social revolution of the 60s and 70s, in which religion has waned some more and permissiveness increasingly dominates opinion polls. Old-fashioned mores are not coming back, but neither for now is the wild, erotic acting out of the 70s, their often cruel Dionysianism. But let us not congratulate ourselves too quickly. There are ways in which we have passed from eros to thanatos. Thanatos is the Greek for death. From the chaos of unrestrained desire to the stability of senescence. Senescence is like senility. Our era is less overtly sexually destructive, in part because we are giving up on sex itself, retreating into pornography and other virtual consolations. In the 1970s, people left their marriages because they believed some higher fulfillment awaited. In the 2010s, they marry less, have less sex once married, and have fewer children, opting out of promiscuity and procreation both. Abortion rates are down, but suicide rates are up. Hefnerism seems to have led us through orgiastic excess to depressing onanism. So we could talk more about this area and the issues I haven't addressed. But I want to set the background to the issues we face in terms of sexuality and gender in this broader context of an unraveling of a social fabric. And finally, we have something we've already talked about, the rise of the nuns. I talked about it specifically in relationship to the Jewish world. But I pointed out that it's something that's happening in the culture as a whole. A Pew Research study showed that the percentage of Americans who believe in God, attend religious services, and pray daily declined significantly from 2007 to 2014. At the same time as people's interest in spiritualism and things like that is going up. A wide variety of spiritualities thrive, but what people, I think, again, want is something that fits this broader picture I'm painting. Every individual is on their own individual journey. They have their own individual narrative, and they're looking to find out how they can realize and fulfill their individual narrative. But the very nature of the community of God, the people of God, whether we've been looking at the Jewish people of the church, is the individual story only exists in the context of the corporate story. It's not my story, it's our story. And my narrative, my personal narrative, can only make sense when it's part of a grand narrative, the fundamental narrative that is told us in Scripture and that carries on through all of history, that shapes everything about how we see our individual story. But that requires us to be bound up to the life of a community of people that has a history and institutions and exists through time. And it asks for commitment, and it calls for trust, and it makes demands on us. And that's something that is very, very difficult for people to say yes to today. And at the very same time, and this is the tragedy about it, it's what they most need. The very thing that is, it's the answer, the solution. It's the thing that folks are most resistant to in their own brokenness and mistrust. And that leads me to what is really my conclusion, which is the positive end of the story. Okay, we're done with the depressing part. We're supposed to be part of the answer to this. You know? The people of God as a whole, the church is supposed to be the answer, the Jewish people are supposed to be the answer, and we are supposed to be an answer to this as well, as part of both communities. These currents I've described make it more difficult than ever to form successful communities. These are the things we're continually pressing against when we're trying to build the kind of trust and commitment that is required to actually live together and be what Hashem wants us to be. My own view is that we have to, for at least a period of time, give up on the goal of a huge growth in numbers. You know, that we shouldn't be focused right now on numbers. We need to focus on quality and genuine community and passing on that life. And so it requires connection to the world. It connects and it requires outreach, and I'm going to talk more about that tonight. But we shouldn't have some kind of illusion when you're living in a time of judgment. You shouldn't be having grand illusions of thousands and thousands of people coming and entering into your doors. I think we're kind of going like through a tunnel, and we have to go in. And we have to go through it. If we're faithful, I think we have the potential to be part of the answer. But it's not going to be easy because we don't live in, again, a bubble apart from everything I just described. We are part of that world. We experience some of those same things. We experience depression. We experience anxiety. Our marriages and families are tested. It's not like us and them. This is us. We're part of that secular culture. We're exposed to it. But we have to go through it and pass the test and find a way to one another and find a way in the midst of it to actually live together. In the Christian world recently, there was a book written that got a lot of attention, and it was dealing with these kinds of questions. It was called the Benedict option, the Benedict option, and it refers to Saint Benedict, who was established a pattern of monastic life, which when the Western world was collapsing into the Dark Age in the 6th century and the 7th century, it was the Benedictine monasteries that preserved Western civilization and also evangelized a lot of the pagan tribes, the Germanic tribes, and really gave birth to the new civilization of the Middle Ages. And so this idea of the Benedict option is that this call to churches to give the right kind of attention to forming communities that are a kind of counterculture, that can be the germ of something new that can emerge after the time of judgment has passed. Then I saw an article by an Orthodox Jewish writer saying, that what you're describing as the Benedict option, that's Orthodox Judaism. That's what she said. One of the things I think all of this means for us, and I'm sure you've experienced this already, is that when you have new people coming into your community, the transition is sometimes more significant. It takes more for you to bring them from where they are to where they need to be in order to live in community with others. And so that's part of the reason we can't just focus on numbers. We have to be able to invest in helping those people make the transition. We can't do a superficial job. It's not just a question of praying with somebody to receive Yeshua and then go on to the next person. That's just not going to cut it in our current situation. We're going to have to work with people over a sustained period of time to help them to find their way into a different kind of life. I think really fundamentally what we have as an answer is the message of the twofold people of God. And I say the message of the twofold people of God because part of the message really is carried in the Jewish people, and part of this message is carried in the church, as I think was revealed to some extent by this woman who pointed to Orthodox Judaism as the Benedict option. What the Jewish people have learned through history is how to live in a diaspora, how to be in exile, how to have communities that are different from the world around them, and yet can thrive and preserve their life. And to have a sense of continuity, to have a sense of being a people. Being a people. Being a people involves something tangible. It involves actual communities of people living together and passing on their life, and from generation to generation being able to look back and say, yes, those were my parents and those were my grandparents, and we're all part of this same reality, and I'm passing it on to my children. The church has often lost that. And with this tendency to focus on a universal, invisible church. And so it tends to lose the sense of peoplehood. And what's needed most now is, in fact, that message of peoplehood. Now, what the church has, of course, that the Jewish people doesn't have, is this fundamental missionary calling and vocation to go out to the world, to go out to the nations, to change everything. Now, the Jewish people, we have this sense of tikkun olam, which is make the world a better place. But it's not about enabling people to come in and share in the life of our own community, our own people. And that's what people need most now. It's not just do some good things for them. Give some tzedakah to the poor. What people need now, yes, they need food and they need all kinds of material things, but what people most need now is to actually be part of a community. The church could do that if it could recover its own sense of what it meant to be a people. And I think it could get that from its relationship to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people could get something about the nature of outreach of bringing the God of Israel to the nations through the church. And we stand as that bridge between these two worlds. This message of the people of God, I think, is the true nationalism that we need. It's not a false nationalism that's this abstraction. It's something that's rooted in our actual daily life. Our individual And family life needs to bear witness to the truth that we proclaim about Yeshua and about the people of God. But that's not enough. We need to form real life communities with stable commitment, whose corporate life shows what the world around us desperately needs, even while it's terrified to death of finding it. And at the same time, these communities need to be filled with the life-giving Spirit of God that Rich was talking about earlier in his message. It's not just community. It's community that is experiencing the overwhelming love and presence of God, that is healing, that will enable those people who come to us broken from this world, entering into our life, and what they'll experience is not only the healing relationships that exist within our life, but the direct healing presence of God. There's nothing like the love of God to make us new and to make us whole. Okay, finally our text from Acts is a very familiar text, Acts chapter 2. You know, the first followers of Yeshua, they lived in a time of judgment too. You know, that was the message of Yochanan, of John the Immerser, and the message of Yeshua too. The judgment was going to come basically, four decades later. You know, there was a delay, from the prophecy, and then a few decades, and then it came. And so Pentecost, Shavuot occurs, the Spirit comes, and Peter gives his message, proclaiming Yeshua as raised from the dead. Now when they heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and to the other apostles, "Brothers, what should we do?" Peter said to them, "Repent and be immersed, every one of you, in the name of Yeshua the Messiah, so that your sins may be forgiven, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. For the promise is for you, for your children, and for all who are far away, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to him." And he testified with many other arguments and exhorted them, saying, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." So those who welcomed his message were immersed, and that day about 3,000 persons were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and community, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. The response to being in a time of judgment is repentance, tshuva, both for ourselves and for others, because God desires to be merciful. And this prophetic message that the apostles bring calls for this tshuva and then calls for some kind of action as a result to it, which is, it's not just believe and maybe attend a service once a week. It's believe and then have your whole life changed because it's being bound up to the life of another set of people. You're giving your life away. You're receiving a life too, but you're giving your life away. And what they're experiencing in the midst of their community life is this overwhelming power of the Holy Spirit that's promised to Israel in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. The forgiveness of sins, the renewal of the covenant, the grace of the world to come, olam haba. And it leads them to share their goods with one another, to live joyfully in the presence of Hashem. A life of praise, both in their home settings and with one another. And then we see also in the temple. And in the temple, to some extent, they were by themselves. But what we also find is that they were going to worship during the morning and the afternoon korbanot, sacrifices. I'll talk more about that tonight. But they were participating in the worship of the people as a whole, even as they also had this prophetic message. And of course, the result was the world was changed. Not immediately, but eventually. Ultimately, the Jewish people were changed through the judgment that came. A kind of renewal came to the Jewish people as a whole after 70. And, of course, the nations of the world were, the whole situation in the world was never going to be the same as a result of what was going on in their midst. I think if we're faithful at this time, we can live like that too. In the midst of a time of judgment, we can live lives of joy and lives of praise of Hashem, and lives that are engaged with people around us who are suffering and who are in need, as we try to help them put the pieces back together. But the way we, I think, ultimately do that is by bringing them into a different environment, that a set of relationships that themselves can contribute to making them whole. Okay, time for comments or questions. So, Rachel?
I'm curious if you could just speak for a minute about the intersection of faith-based communities in some of these statistics that you've spoken about, specifically in sexuality and the broader realm and the suicide and the depression.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, in general, I'm just going to generalize. Obviously, every community has different standards. But you talk about the rise of suicides, the rise of pornography over actual, sexual affairs or these types of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is born out of, in some ways, in faith-based communities. We've driven these statistics by, pornography is treated differently than a sexual affair within faith-based communities. Same with the rate of LGBTQ individuals committing suicide is way higher, along with their depression. And a lot of these are coming out of faith-based communities, which is why they're depressed or why they end up committing suicide. Just wanted to see if you could speak to that for a minute in that intersection.
Yes. Well, I think that is. I do think it's the case that, particularly the church, or maybe let's just say the Christian world in the United States has not been markedly better on this front than the wider society. It has suffered in the same way, and that certainly leads one to wonder about just about the level of faithfulness overall. And but I maybe again another angle on this is simply to say that the church and the Jewish people as part of this country are being judged. We're all being judged. In other words, that it's not like they're being judged. When you're part of a wider community, because we're also part of this whole country. We are part of that secular culture. It's not, and so we experience it too, and so I think it does. It should call for serious reflection about how we deal with these kinds of things. And I do think that this issue of how parents and communities deal, with kids who come out, and it's a big deal. And is is it possible to have some kind of standard on these things that upholds something resembling a traditional perspective, and at the same time create an environment which allows for difference and for one another, and for kids who don't conform to the standards that we set, and learning to love one another despite our differences, and not have our love be something which is contingent on those kinds of agreement on controverted standards. But I mean, these are the kinds of things we all have to be reflecting on, I think, and in a time like the one in which we live. It's a start, though, if we realize we're living in a time like this, rather than walking around not being unaware of what's actually happening right now. Okay, so Sid, wait for the mic.
I wonder if we have to rewrite history so it's Messianic Jewish, because I can't study Jewish history. There are brief resurgences and renaissances, and most of the time, it's basically the Christians beating up on us. I mean, bad beating up on us. And that's hard. I mean, it seems like almost everything done by the Jews is done in Yeshua's name. It's really hard for me when I want to reach out to intelligent Jews, and they know this, okay? But there's probably a lot of times where Christians have come alongside Jews in history in productive ways, but we don't hear about that. So I'm wondering, I mean, this is a big hurdle. It's a big hurdle. I've been actually thinking about going back to church some because I live in the boonies up in Maine. There is no Messianic synagogue. The closest Messianic synagogue is an hour away. I come down to this one maybe every other week. But if I try it every week, it's taken a toll on me from all the driving. And, there were some things I liked about church. Oh, they all believed they were the new Jews. Okay, I got it. And I was an old, completed Jew, and all the theology was wacko. I get it, but I was never comfortable there either. Partially because I'm not sure they would have let me be comfortable, or God would let me be comfortable, and I ended up here in 2000. But I mean, history is, I can't study Jewish history. It's too depressing.
Yes. Well, I find, Jewish history has its depressing aspects if you are, like us, a Messianic Jew. If you're, I think that for the reasons you mentioned, because of shame over what's done to the Jewish people in the name of Jesus. But really, if you study, it is the case that it's not as bad as it sometimes appears. Part of the problem is you've got 2,000 years, and then the tendency is to focus on some of these periods, which are the worst periods. Things, in some ways, things don't get really bad until the Middle Ages, and until the Crusades. The Crusades, in the late 11th century. And the first 1,000 years is nothing to write home about. It's not like, but it's not as terrible as what comes later. And the thing is that Jewish history as a whole, I think, is extraordinary. The way we don't just survive, the way we manage to thrive and to prosper and both spiritually and the emergence of just these massive achievements like the Talmud, they're just really quite amazing against all odds. And to me, they're just the sign of God's presence and God's favor in the life of the Jewish people. And that's why, for me, despite all of those bad things that happen in the name of Jesus, Jewish history it's essential for being able to discern the work of God. But there also are those lights in the midst of it. And I recommend, if one of the better books about Jewish-Christian relations was written 70 or 80 years ago by a Russian Orthodox priest by the name of Lev Gillet. It's called Communion in the Messiah. And it's this really amazingly positive picture where he's trying to talk about the relationship of the Jewish people and the church. It points really towards this kind of converging destinies approach that Rabbi Stewart is presenting. And he's writing it in the midst of World War II. It's quite extraordinary. I'd recommend you might want to take a look at that, because he's got some pictures of some descriptions of some of the more positive incidents in the history. Yeah. So, okay, we got someone on this side? Great, Joshua.
Thanks, Rabbi Mark. Okay, so this might bleed into the next session. Feel free to put off the question. But since you brought up, depression and other trends within the society around us, Messianic Judaism is a hard place, like Messianic Jewish congregations is a hard place sometimes, given a lot of identity, ambiguity, and instability. And, a lot of millennials, for example, want to seek out what they find to be authenticity. And I feel like the MJRC is really putting forward, by establishing standards and promoting, a healthy path to conversion, starting to address becoming more relevant to the reality around us. But I guess, again, this might go into the next session. In what sort of ways is the MJRC kind of promoting itself in an ethical level to the wider Messianic Jewish world as something relevant that could help address some of these issues in wider society, especially with young folks who are dealing with depression and all these other issues? If they're coming into a place where people don't know who they are, it's just it's not sustainable long term. So what is the MJRC doing actively to, because I know not a lot of individuals are still against it within the movement itself. So what's that process looking like? But it might bleed into the next session, so feel free to push off the question.
No, it doesn't really. I wasn't going to be talking so much about the MJRC in the next session. Rabbi Rich, do you have anything you want to say about this? I think Rabbi Rich is even more involved in the overall leadership of the MJRC than I am, and so I think why don't you speak to this?
Sure. So there's a positive and a negative answer. The positive answer is that we have this deep intuition as an MJRC that there's a desperate need, psychologically, spiritually, even from indirectly as a health measure, to provide some kind of boundaries that circumscribe and define Messianic Jewish life on the ground. Because without those boundaries, you can't have sustainable transgenerational community. That's the good side. So it is the indirect result of the kinds of things, even something as subtle as something that Rabbi Mark has worked on, which is called the Chaye Yeshua reading cycle. Don't underestimate the power of a corporate reading cycle as a bonding element among different congregations, reinforcing community as a high value and the indirect but very meaningful effect that has on individual lives. There's something about the regularity, even within the congregation year after year, that at a subtle but powerful level has its own healing effect. All of that is the good news. The bad news is that, frankly, we're all so busy in building so many different institutions, and many of us are, getting older, that there are a lot of issues that we realize that we have just not had opportunity to really address at a foundational level. Issues of sexuality, issues of other areas of moral acuity that we need to develop for a Messianic Jewish movement. I should say, I'll make one other comment about it. Part of the reason that we haven't made more progress in that area has to do with the realization of our executive committee, a rather large executive committee, that we actually had to take a step back because we had to answer a prior theological question that we had left unanswered, but that if we didn't answer, we couldn't make any progress in any of the practical areas, and that was this. I'll just tell you what it was so you don't think it's, so you have a sense of the depth of that we try and approach things with. We ask ourselves the question, in the early years, we thought that the halakhic pronouncements were a function of just declaiming on halakha as it's been handed down in the Jewish tradition. In recent years, we've said, no, our mandate extends further. We have a mandate to actually create halakhic norms for our communities because the halakha as it's been handed down is not adequate to the Messianic Jewish experience. And we had to ferret out if, in fact, we really could arrogate to ourselves that level of authority and responsibility. And that takes time when you only meet once a year. So I'm just saying, in a way, I'm asking you, in an implicit way, to cut us a break. We're dealing with very, very, very deep issues. And we're not skirting anything. It's almost like the founding fathers of the United States saying, listen, before we put this Constitution together, we really need to deal with the slavery issue because we can't move ahead unless that's resolved. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and it resulted in the Civil War. So I'm saying that we are adequate in that we are doing some things, inadequate because we're not meeting a lot of the needs you're addressing, but we're saying that there's a lot of stuff that we've had to deal with in order to move ahead. So, John, I hope that helps a little bit.
Well, I'm so not a theologian, and so my question's always simple views here. But on just your subject of the secular landscape and where we stand today, I really do agree, and I feel very much like you, that these are those times. But this really simple thought I get for you, and I love your reaction. So it was when my son was going to preschool, he kept talking about Santa Claus. Mommy, Santa Claus, when's he coming? When's he coming? I said, and finally one day I said, honey, if you're Jewish, the Hanukkah fairy comes down your chimney. And if you're Christian, Santa Claus comes down your chimney. And he said, okay, Mom, so I'm Christian. Just like that, the logic, right? So how I look at it so simply, which it's not, is where we are today. It's if you're Jewish and you believe in Yeshua, and you're with your people, with your Jewish people, all of this craziness around us, we can so communicate with our people the light of Yeshua, because we're our people, and we're the Messianic Jews, and it just feels like it's a natural fit. And yet, and the secularism is the part that I'm relating to, because so many Jewish people I talk to are seeking. Yeah. This is a time in my short, 16, 17 years in this movement, from the beginning to now, so many Jews are interested in just talking about Yeshua. Not that they're going to believe in him right now, but the door is open. So when you're Jewish, when you're Messianic Jewish, and you're with your people, it's okay, Mom, Yeshua, And if you're Christian, you're with your people, whatever, you got the Yeshua thing. Now, I know that's really simple, and I probably just said something offensive to someone, but the truth is, Messianic Jewish walking, at least with one portion of our community, isn't as hard, or it seems kind of too simple because of the secular nature of the people we're speaking with. Could you react to that?
No, I think that is. I'll say a little bit more about it tonight, but I do think that the people we are called to be serving in a special way on this level are Jews. That's why we exist as a Messianic Jewish community. We have a partnership with the church, and so we're speaking when we're speaking to Christians, about we're participating in Israel's mission in relationship to the church. But that's different than when we're, the fundamental calling to what we're doing within our congregation, and that's fundamentally to Jewish people. And it's certainly true. The statistics bear you out that right now, the majority of Jewish people are, they are not Jews by religion. They would identify more as Jews by ancestry and culture. And most of them are in that category of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S. But the thing that's significant about that category, again, is that they might not see themselves as religious, but they do tend to see themselves as spiritual, which means they are seeking, they're on a quest. And so there is a door, I think, open for talking. Ultimately, though, the challenge is still going to be being able to connect up with something that calls them to connect with people and an actual community, in effect, an institution. And that's the challenge that we'll face in those settings, like we'll face with anybody else in the society today. So, this side?
So, thank you, Rabbi Mark. I'm thinking about Rabbi Rich's comments about how as Messianic Jews we're seeking to define ourselves in relation to the challenges brought about by this new secularism, how we establish halakhic norms and ethos to respond in a way that's traditional and authentic to us as Messianic Jews. The implications of bilateral ecclesiology, there's a joint goal where in the body of Messiah, the nations and Israel are moving together to establish one goal, intimacy and connection.
Yeah.
So how do we establish a framework where there's a intersection of values that will resonate in terms of this secularism and establish something that is identifiable that we have in common amongst Israel and the nations, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well,
so Rabbi Rich was addressing, what we're thinking about from Messianic Jewish standpoint. I'm trying to combine it with this bilateral notion.
But yes. Well, I actually think that, like in the kind of interdiscussions we would have in the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, those are issues that also come up. I mean, because we see ourselves as also indebted to the Christian tradition in some ways. And so already in our documents where we talk about our sources of authority and the basis on which we make judgments, we recognize the need to take into account not just Jewish tradition, but also in some level Christian tradition. And what we're also having to do is, in seeking halachic clarity, some of that has to do with seeking some kind of establishing a halachic status for Christian Gentiles. This is this is an issue we have to deal with, that the wider Jewish world doesn't have to deal with. Because what bilateral ecclesiology fundamentally means is we believe that there are non-Jews, there are Gentiles who, by virtue of being Christians, are now part of the covenant people of God. They have a new status, but that's a status that traditional Jewish halakha does not recognize. In traditional halakha, you simply have Jews and then you have non-Jews, and then there's various ways of trying to work with the people who are on their way maybe to becoming Jews. But fundamentally, you have two categories. And for us, there has to be a third category. And it has to have some kind of halachic implications. And so, for example, on this, one of the issues we're working on right now in the MJRC is marriage issues. And what does it mean when a Jew, a Messianic Jew, marries a non-Jew? That's the kind of issue that's being dealt with now in the wider Jewish world. And they're trying to say, well, some rabbis are now willing to officiate and do certain type of ceremonies, but they make qualifications into what the ceremony would look like. But they don't have this additional issue that we have. For them, again, it's just a Jew marrying a non-Jew. For us, it's a Jew marrying a non-Jew who's also part of the covenant community. And so we can't, so this raises a different set of issues. And so I think we have, in the very process of working out our own halakha, we're doing things that make clear how we view our Christian partners, and that they're not just an other, that they really do belong with us, even though they have a distinct existence. I think beyond that, we have to find ways of a kind of outreach. I don't think at this point the MJRC is the place where that's happening. A lot of my own work is actually that kind of thing. You know, what I've done in the Messianic Jewish Roman Catholic dialogue, I'm involved in a Messianic Jewish Anglican dialogue. Even the Helsinki consultation is continually bringing me into connection with Jews from these other traditions, but then that puts me in connection with those traditions, these Christian traditions. And so different ones of us are involved in these things in various ways. So on this side?
Yeah, so I have two general questions. First one relates to what you were just speaking about. Does the MJRC have a concrete definition on anything related to the Ger Toshav? Like, the righteous convert and, those verses within the Torah that talks about, the sojourners and what have you. And then the second question is, what is your opinion about, not urban ministry, but for example, it's like New York, there's only about 3 or 4 Messianic congregations. There's not really much here in Boston besides Ruach Israel that I can think of off the top of my head. And it's like, that's where there's a ton more that needs to be done because of the nature of the cities and how much goes on there and how much outreach there needs to be and the amount of Jewish people that there are there as well. So do you have a way, a plan for New York or Boston or anything like that? No.
It's the easiest question that's been asked so far. I think I will. I will talk a bit more about models of Messianic Jewish community tonight, and I think that's applicable to the questions you're mentioning. But I think what you're looking for is much more of a whole kind of outreach plan, and that's something that I don't have, and I don't know of anyone in our circles that does. I think it would be great to get to some point where we did. In terms of the Ger Toshav, for those of you who, not familiar, there is this distinction, this traditional Jewish distinction between, the Ger Toshav and the Ger Tzedek, the full proselyte who comes in to the community and becomes a Jew, the convert, and then the Ger Toshav as someone who is connected, living in the midst of the people, but really does not become a fully Jew. Now, we don't. One of the interesting things is Jewish tradition itself does not. We have the term and we have some discussion of it, but to a great extent, it kind of drops out as a category in rabbinic thought. It gets talked about sometimes in our circles, but you really it kind of gets replaced by the B'nai Noach category in traditional Jewish thought. And one of the reasons for that appears to be the fact that, the Ger Toshav made sense at a period of time when you had lots of non-Jews flocking to the synagogue, and the category also sometimes called the God-fearers, who were on the outskirts of Jewish life, connected to Jewish life, but not entering fully in and becoming a convert. But once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, you basically had restrictions on what people could do. Jews could not proselytize, and so at that point in time, you no longer had, in a visible way, lots of non-Jews who were in this status. Now, the reality was you still had some, at least in the 5th century, but it became less and less common as the centuries went along. And so it was replaced simply by this notion of what is required from Gentiles, just because they are through the covenant with Noah. I think in some ways what we're doing in our movement is trying to, in some ways, resurrecting this notion of the ger toshav, or the God-fearer. But God-fearer I don't think adequately works as a term in English, because I think all Christians should be viewed as God-fearers, not just the Gentiles in the Messianic movement. And so in some ways, the equivalent in our sphere of ger toshav would be what was talked about yesterday as the Messianic Gentile. A Gentile who's entering into the Messianic Jewish sphere. But then you also, though, have Gentiles or Christians who are now in the synagogue sphere, who are, participating in conservative synagogues and Reformed temples. And so obviously they're not Messianic Gentiles. And so it's almost like raising again the ancient world situation, where there was a lot more of this back and forth, Gentiles in the sphere of the synagogue, and Jews more in the sphere of the church. So, sure, back to Rabbi Rich, yeah.
Mark, I would like to go back to the kind of conundrum that Diane was articulating, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the degree to which, or some descriptives of what having a covenant community would be like in a dark time, and what you imagine the parameters would be. And I think of the fact that the more things change, the more they are the same. The Qumran community had its own answer to the darkness that they felt that they lived in, and that was a kind of total separation, even geographically.
Exactly.
The Essenes were a mixed bag, but the Qumran community. I think a number of us wonder, we like football, and I like jazz, and there are some communities who would see themselves as, come out from them and be separate as being quite stark. I know there's no right or wrong or definitive answer here, but I think it would be helpful for us all to hear some of your instincts, any things that come to mind about parameters.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this tonight, because one of the things I want to discuss is tonight is something that doesn't exist in the Messianic Jewish movement right now, which is the phrase I use for it is intentional community. But I think that if we look at communities that actually have survived and made a difference, like again, Qumran ultimately failed. It failed, and on the other hand, the Pharisees succeeded, and they were a kind of community too, but they had their own life, but it was obviously had more flexibility, and was able to adapt to the new circumstances, and Judaism was able to get reconstructed to some extent around them. I think the monastic movement in the church is itself a fascinating example, and really worthy of study. The thing that's interesting to me about both the monastic movement and then the way religious orders developed in the Catholic Church. Religious orders are all basically these intentional communities. where people make these long-term commitments to one another, and they live together and put their lives in common. You have these communities that many of them have existed continuously for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And the thing that one notices about them is they're all different in the way in which they approach the kinds of questions you were talking about. I mean, you have some Catholic communities where they're cloistered, where it means that it very, very restricted access to anything in the outside world. Particularly, this is with some nuns. But then you've got other religious orders, like the Jesuits, who are immersed in the midst of the world, doing. You could find them doing almost anything, and then it's the whole gamut between it. And part of why I want to point that all out is I don't think there is a right and a wrong way. I think there are different vocations, there are different callings, and each one has the potential to respond to certain situations more effectively than other situations. The one thing to point out, though, about the more removed type of communities in those contexts is the thing that was different about Qumran was Qumran thought it was the be-all and the end-all. It thought it was the Jews. And as a result, it could recruit in some ways from Jews outside. But you wouldn't have people like just someone from Galilee say, I'm going to go take a retreat at Qumran, and I'll have a couple of good days of prayer and then I'll come back refreshed, It didn't work that way. But, that's the way monastic communities function within the Catholic Church. They're not, they are removed in the sense of they have a community which is fashioned to be separate and distinct, but they have a kind of outreach that serves all of these other Catholics. Catholics come to them, and because they create this environment which is so all-encompassing in terms of prayer and allows people to get away from their normal activities into this serene, prayerful environment, they come into that environment, they're there for 2 days, 3 days, a week or something, and their life gets renewed. Their spiritual life gets renewed, and they get a new vision of what it means to be, a disciple of Yeshua through the modeling and example of these people who've dedicated their life sacrificially. And so, for all of these communities, even the most reclusive ones in the Catholic world, they're always connected to the outside. They always have a sense of they are never separate. Even their prayer is always for the world. It's for the church, for the Jewish people, whatever, And so I think I could see any number of different kinds of communities with, emerging depending on what their particular calling is. But I think the key is they all have, no matter how removed they are or connected they are, they both have to have a distinct life in themselves, and then they need to have that sense of relationship to the world outside them and to particularly the people of God outside them.
Very helpful. Let's take one more question, and then we're going to finish up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Kinzer, for taking questions. Mine is two-part, in case one, either you'll answer later or you choose not to. So we come from an area where most of our little group is Gentile. And they're there because they want to deepen their understanding of their faith. And they have a question, which I'm going to put to you, which is, what would be some good materials to use for their question, which is, how do we bless the Jewish people? And so they didn't, in that question, frame it in terms of Messianic Jews. They're saying the Jewish people.
Yeah.
So that's the first question. The second one has to do more with our leadership in the group, and it is, we have a tension because of our membership of being Jewish and celebrating Jewishly and teaching. and how do we satisfy both? we have a very different problem than most of you even think about here in areas that you live, because we're remote. Just imagine you're in the desert. And it's not many, I'm not talking Israel. I'm talking Yuma, Arizona, so it's out there. So yeah, we have sort of a reverse issue. So if you could somehow address those. Thank you.
Yes. I wish I could. I don't know that I can. I'm not, like on the first question, in terms of what would I point people to who are looking to find out how they can most bless Israel? I'm not sure I know. I mean, it's not the area I work in most, or that I'm most familiar with, or primarily dealing with, and so I'm like someone who's not really an expert on something. Don't really feel like I have anything. There may be others here who actually could do a better job of answering that question. Actually, let me just see. Is there anybody here who would like to take a stab at that? If we could get the microphone to Eugene here.
Maybe after the session.
Okay, actually, that's a good point. Good, very good. Talk to Eugene about that, the first question. And again, on the second question, I mean, these questions of, they're very personal questions. How do you balance in your life, two things that you're doing that are really quite different? And I think what you really need, again, I'm not sure that I have like general principles, which is all I would be able to give you anyways, and that it'd be more like I or someone would need to sit down and talk to you and find out very concretely what your life, the shape of your life is like, and and then make some recommendations. I mean, in some ways, it's the fundamental balance between what you need to receive yourself, and then in order to be able to do what you're doing to serve others, and that is the balance. We all live with that. You pour out and give of yourself to others, but you need to take in. You need to be strengthened yourself, and if you're going to be able to give to anyone else. And so I think it's a continual tension and challenge for everyone.
Okay, very good. Rabbi Mark, thank you so much for your insights. So helpful. We have one more session coming up this evening where Rabbi Mark is going to tie it all together and help us in a lot of practical ways as we think about how do we contour Messianic Judaism for the future. I'd like to call Ralph up. He has some words for us about how people in YouTube land and how people in our own synagogues can access these materials in the future. So Ralph, you got it.
That's really amazing to listen to Mark, and there are some things that you get right away, and some things you want to go back and revisit later and just digest all over again. And you can do that. Even if you missed a session, they're all up on YouTube, and they are available on demand session by session. And the way you do that, if you don't understand internet speak, if you do, great. You can go to Google and put in YouTube space Ruach Israel, and you should find our channel. And then finding the New Vision conference sessions from there should be easy. And if you know YouTube, you can go right there again, search for the Ruach Israel YouTube channel, and you'll be rolling. But if you don't understand what that means, I'm findable. You can call the office here and get my contact information. Call me, I will help you. Any questions that you have. And while you're in there on the internet retrieving a session, if you wanted to leave a positive comment about Ruach Israel in Google or in Yelp or in any of the other internet venues, we would greatly appreciate that. Think of it as planting seeds for others to find. And if your review is not going to be positive, just call us. You can talk directly. We'll take that comment without your posting it at all. But seriously, everything is up. The session for 4 will be up in a little while, about another half an hour, and likewise with the later session today. Call me if you have any questions at all.
Ralph, thank you, and a word of just appreciation for you, because you have done such a phenomenal job. Thank you. And so has Michelle.
There are many other volunteers here. That a lot of people are contributing. Thanks to all of them.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to ask Shana to come up and say a word about the rest of our time, Shabbat afternoon, Havdalah, etc. Shana?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Rich. Great session, Rabbi Mark. Thank you very much. We're going to break now, and we do have pizzas coming here at 5:30. Getting delivered here. I did take a head count yesterday and added in a few extras for those of you that weren't here, so feel free to enjoy that. Otherwise, we can see you back here at 7, and we will start the evening session with Havdalah, and then go right into the final session for the conference. If you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much, Shana. We're all dismissed. Have a wonderful Shabbat afternoon. We'll see you a little bit later.